So, good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Skinner, founder of MarketingKind, and welcome to this MarketingKind exchange in which we'll begin the new year by reimagining how we think about and create the future with our special guest, Rob Hopkins, who has a long history of future creation and who has both improved and revealed his formula for success in his latest book, How to Fall in Love with the Future, a time traveler's guide to changing the world. Brian Eno has said that this book will lift your spirits and give you hope. George Monbiot has said that it's exactly the book that we need. And Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall has said that it makes optimism credible and compelling. The book also contains a couple of endorsements from former MarketingKind exchange guests, Manda Scott and John Alexander. And indeed, today's conversation might prompt people to remember Manda's views on how through utopian fiction can be a pathway to a better future, or indeed John Alexander's views on how we can better engage with people as citizens in bringing that reality into being. Rob has written 5 previous books and is perhaps best known as the co-founder of Transition Network and Transition Town Totnes, and as well as pioneering an alternative future for communities ready to embrace the transition to more sustainable living, has taken the craft of time travel particularly seriously. This is something we believe we need to engage with at MarketingKind, where many of us have a professional responsibility to envision a future that our stakeholders can fall in love with, and where that can be particularly difficult at a time when short-term pressures can predominate, when the future can seem so wildly out of our control, and when the forces lining up against making our tomorrows happier, fairer, and more successful than today might be only too willing to take the upper hand unless we can marshal every ounce of our creative energy and skill. So on that note, Rob, welcome to MarketingKind. How are you feeling this evening?
Hi, Paul. Very good. I'm thrilled to be here looking at this, the luminaries joining us here this evening and feeling very honored to have been invited into your living room on this cold and stormy Thursday evening.
Well, it's very good to connect with the founder of the Transition Network, direct from Totnes. Rob, I have heard that you have traveled to the future with your friend Mr. Kit and made an important stop in the year 2030. So I think it would be remiss of me to bury the headline by doing anything other than starting by asking you what it is like in 2030.
Well, I think the first thing to point out is that, many of you will know Totnes. You may have been here, and it's the place where the transition movement started. It's where the first vegetable box scheme in the country started. But what you probably don't know is that we're also home to the first successful time travel research program. We're like the kind of Cape Canaveral of time travel research here. And we take regular trips into the future, and we're not interested in traveling forward 100 200 years. We really kind of go 5 6 years ahead, 4 years ahead into the future, because what fascinates me is that if we're to have any chance of avoiding catastrophic climate change, the best roadmap we have, even though it's imperfect and it's not ambitious enough, is the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement says that by 2036, so in let's say 10 years from now, we need to have cut our emissions by about 55, 60%. That's a huge thing, right? But if we don't do that, we have no chance of meeting the targets of where we need to get to. I don't buy into this idea that somehow technology is going to invent some amazing machine that'll magically suck all the CO2 out of the air and put everything right again. It's not going to happen. We actually have to change things in order for this to be the case. So what fascinates me is what that 2036 is like. The 2036 that's the result of us doing everything we could possibly have done. And as part of that research, we visit many different quantum threads to different futures. And there are many that are absolutely horrible. Believe me, we've been to see them. You can trust me on that. We really, really don't want to go there. The futures that arise from us not doing anything, the business as usual futures, are too horrible for me really to go in to describe where we end up in some of those futures. But the ones that we go to just on the outer edges of possibility, but they're there nonetheless. The ones that resulted from us doing absolutely everything we possibly could have done are kind of exhilarating and extraordinary. And it feels to me like in this 2026, where the future is being cancelled and colonized, that building those kind of bridges of possibility to what those futures would be like. As Bell Hooks said, what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. And the more that we can do to connect people to those futures, the better. And so that's what we do. And for me, that work was triggered by seeing a T-shirt in 2021 that a young woman was wearing on a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington. And it said, "I've been to the future. We won." And it gave me such massive goosebumps, and it profoundly shifted the direction of the work that I was doing. And that was what kind of led me into discovering as well this whole amazing kind of um, world, particularly in the US, of women of color writing books about imagination and time travel, not responding. I got fed up basically, Paul, with reading books by middle-aged white guys talking about collapse and extinction, and actually this whole kind of world of people writing who for whom culturally everything collapsed like 400 or 500 years ago. That's not news, but actually are responding in this time by writing about the radical imagination. People like Edrin Marie Brown, Ruha Benjamin, Black Quantum Futurism, Walida Imarisha, people who say talk about science fiction is strategy. That's what kind of gets me fired up. And so that's what sent us into our laboratory in Totnes with our quantum tools to get to work.
Yeah, it's interesting. Science fiction is so much usually about technology, and one of the things that I enjoyed appreciating in your book was thinking about the nature of the future, and thinking about the sounds of the future as the kinds of birdsong we might hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, your comments were just so much like the prelude to an opera with all the themes that we can dive into more. But just before we do that, you have your own story, your own past, present, and future. What would you say the book most inherits from your own past, and what are you hoping that it will most contribute to your future and to the future of others?
I guess I've what's always underpinned my work since, I mean, punk was a huge influence for me when I was like 13, 12, 13. Massive thing. That whole thing of do it yourself. And if you don't like things as they are, change it. There was a beautiful, I remember a very famous thing from a punk fanzine in 1976, and it showed you how to play three chords on a guitar. And it said, "Here are three chords, now form a band."
Mm.
And I love that kind of simplicity. And that really, when I was a permaculture teacher for quite a long time, and I loved when I discovered permaculture reading this concept of earth repair, that someone had written a book about how to put it all back together again. Like, we can study how these natural systems work and actually rebuild them and recreate them. And so for a long time, I was a teacher of permaculture. And when we started the transition movement, there was always an element in the transition movement that was about imagination. Visioning was a big part of it from the beginning. One of my great heroes, the prison abolition activist Mariam Kaba in America, she always says, "We must imagine while we build, always both." And that was a fundamental idea in the transition movement from the very, very beginning. And I think really the last book that I wrote was called From What Is to What If, and that book said, at a time when we are facing the climate and ecological emergency, which demands that we fundamentally reimagine everything. At a time we're coming into that crisis, I fear with our imagination, our collective imagination should be a superpower like this, and it's become like this. We've built the perfect conditions for our imaginations to become weakened and impoverished and kind of desiccated at the very time when our survival really depends on our ability to reimagine everything. So from what is to what if was a dive into that, was a kind of putting imagination back on the table and going, this really matters. This really matters. If collectively we allow our imagination to just sort of gradually weaken and weaken and weaken, we leave ourselves so vulnerable. We reduce our ability to find a way through where we are now. I remember Ursula Le Guin had this thing where she said, creativity has become so abused by capitalism that it's a word I never use anymore, but they can't have imagination. And I kind of feel like that. Imagination is such a precious thing right now. So that was what that book was about. And when that finished, I did a podcast series called From What If to What Next, where I interviewed people all around the world doing really interesting work around imagination with a principle from the beginning to never do a single episode with two white male guests. And it made it so much more interesting and opened up this whole kind of world of people doing this fascinating work around playing with time and all this kind of stuff. And that's what really drew me into this book. I just found that I was coming across so many amazing people and activists, and a lot of them kind of feeling like they were working on their own, being really eccentric. And I kind of put them all together and went, actually, what we're seeing here, I hope what we're seeing here is the beginning of what I imagine as a kind of positive futurist movement. That actually those narratives about collapse and extinction, anybody we were going to get on board with narratives of collapse and extinction, they're on board. But there's loads and loads of people that just doesn't get them on board. I did an interview yesterday for the podcast with Solitaire Townsend from Futera, who's also a Shakespearean drama expert. She said, in Shakespearean terms, the climate movement has done a brilliant first act. We've set it up. We've set out a mission. We've created a drama. There's a tension that we need to respond to. But we haven't been very good at the second and the third act, where you go off on an adventure and you find the people who come to your aid and you discover new things. And that's what we've sort of learned and been doing, I think, with the transition movement. And in this book, I wanted to pull all those things together and say, I think we have the seeds here of kind of what comes next in terms of climate activism.
I want to dive in a little bit deeper into what time travel really means for you. Listening to you, there's a similar tension to in the book, in that well, actually, so over the weekend I was recalling a few passages from the French writer Francois Rabelais, and he wrote often in a very light-hearted tone, but about themes that were very serious, often controversial, very important. And listening to you reading the book, what's at stake could hardly be more serious. And there's a real kind of joy to it. And I just wonder, what does time travel as a concept mean for you? And is there something in the showmanship of it that is necessary to overcome despair when people read the news, to overcome lack of self-belief that we can imagine a future that overcomes the constraints we face, that overcomes cynicism, whether real or perceived, in the people that we might need on board? What does time travel as a device mean for you, and how important is it to make some kind of a show out of it that takes us from Act 2 onwards?
So I've been doing talks for many years now, since before the beginning of the transition movement. And for years, I would always start those with 20-25 minutes of all the graphs of everything that's going wrong and photos of tar sands looking like Mordor and all that kind of stuff. And I would notice that when I showed that stuff, people leant away from me. And then when I would start to tell stories about what people in the transition movement were doing, people like them on streets like the streets where they live, who were doing these amazing things, people lean in, right? We're a storytelling creature. That's what distinguishes us. And so for me, the way I like to think about it is very often in the climate movement, we get stuck into these debates around, well, should we be more like Martin Luther King or more like Malcolm X? Should we be just stop oil? Should we be Extinction Rebellion, or should we be the climate majority? Because actually, the people who were on that extreme edge are kind of pushing the Overton window and making what was previously seen as radical ideas appear more mainstream. That's a really important argument and a debate, right? But we tend to get stuck in that. What we tend to miss out of that is that also in the civil rights movement, you had the Black Panthers who were setting up free school meals programs, running ambulances in neighborhoods where nobody else would, setting up free schools. And you also had what we now think of as Afrofuturists and Black utopians, Samuel Delaney, Octavia Butler, Parliament Funkadelic, Sun Ra, people who were filling that future with sort of stories and futures in which centered black people because they weren't centered in any stories about the future at that time. And one of the people from that movement who I get a lot of inspiration from is Sun Ra. And Sun Ra was this incredible jazz musician in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s who told a story about himself where he said, I'm not a human being, actually, I'm an angel from Saturn. And with my band, we travel through space. And he used space travel as a different way of talking about Black liberation from how people like the Black Panthers were at that time. And I read and I read a review of his band when they played in Sheffield in the 80s that said they looked like a school nativity play where everyone had decided to come as one of the three kings. And but the thing was, they all lived in a house together and they dressed like that all the time. They dressed like that if they went to the corner shop to buy a pint of milk or to go to the laundrette. I read an article that described them as everyday utopians. And it said Sun Ra did everything that he did with an unshakable certainty and deadpan humor. Unshakable certainty and deadpan humor. And that's so when I stand up in front of 1,000 people at a conference and tell them in Totnes we've built the world's first time machine and I've actually bought it, and I show little videos, evidence showing that actually, of course, we can do time travel. It's not a joke. It's kind of a it's kind of a device. It's like a playful device. There's something beautiful. Like before H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine, the idea that you could have a device that you could choose to go backwards and forwards to places of your choosing never occurred to anyone. Not to Shakespeare, not to Jules Verne, not to anyone. As soon as H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine, everyone was like, "Oh yeah, great, time machines." And if I can stand up in front of 1,000 people and say this teacup is actually a time machine, and no one goes, "Ah, Rob, now come on, explain to me the quantum mechanics of that." People say, "Oh, cool, where are we going?" There's a beautiful playfulness to it, which kind of allows people to suspend disbelief. Like I can just stand and say, uh, here's a list of policies that we need to create the world in 2036. Yawn. Like that doesn't get into people's bones. Rilke, the poet, said the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. How do we find the ways to do that? And I think when you're working in the climate space, what people are expecting of you is for you to stand up and give a really depressing talk trying to terrify everybody with loads of graphs that do that and that do that, and everyone's going to leave feeling much less jolly than they were when they came in the room. Well, why don't we turn that on its head? Like, because at the moment, what's happening is what the far right are doing is they paint these terrifying visions of the future and then position themselves as strong men who can protect you from that. If at the same time, all the progressive people on the left are also just painting terrifying visions of the future, where's anyone supposed to go? We have to get better at giving people things to run towards than we are at listing the things that people should be running screaming in the opposite direction from, I think.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of our former Marketing Kind exchange guests, Sir Tim Smith, and he's talked about his Tinkerbell theory of storytelling. That if you can tell a story in a way that enough people believe in it and see themselves as part of it, then you essentially can make it a reality.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that this notion of time travel is a very interesting device for achieving something like that.
Well, I would just add one thing to that, actually. There's a young woman who I write about in the book who lives in Berlin called Wasima Labic, who does amazing work that she calls Muslim Futures, working mostly with Muslim women in Berlin. And she uses this term sensual futuring, which I
Mm.
just love, that it's not just about it's not just about creating a mental picture, that future work is also about smell and taste and touch and feel. And so I do a lot of work in the workshops that I do where I get people creating smells and we really make it kind of multi-sensory in that kind of way. It feels really, really important that we just move away from it just being about visual imagining, because also there's like 2-3% of the population who can't do that, who can't form mental pictures of things in their imagination. So we need to find other ways to do that as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we often think about memories in that way. To this day, if I smell a pipe, it makes me think of my late uncle that I stayed with in periods when I was a child, when my father was in hospital. And it recalls another French writer, Proust, and his memorable description of dunking a Madeleine cake in a cup of tea as being a sensory memory
Yeah.
that enabled the adult narrator to recall a whole sort of childhood world. And in a sense, you're opening the door to creating memories of the future.
Memories of the future. Exactly. I was just about to say, yeah.
Where might we go with further embodying that? Because something interesting in the phrase time travel is also the word travel. And travel is embodied. Our brains evolved to enable movement with intentionality. And the journey is from past through the present to the future. Are there other embodiment? Are there other ways to embody a greater confidence in the future? Can we sort of walk towards the future in a way that improves the future that we create?
Yeah, there's an amazing practice that's designed by my friend Ruth Bentovim, which is called Town Anywhere, which is she talks about how we need to create experiences that allow people to rehearse the future.
Mm.
And so Town Anywhere is an activity that you do with between 10 and 400 people in a big space where you time travel basically at the beginning. You physically step over a line. She says you start in the room behind a ribbon in a very small part of the room, looking into an empty hall. And she talks about how hard it is. And at the moment when we look into the future, there's nothing there. And then you count up through the years 2026, 27, 28, 29, 20, 2036, and then you drop the ribbon and you all step into that space. And then you go through this series of activities where you imagine that future, you describe it to other people, you meet other people who share the area of that future that you're most interested in. Like, what are you doing in that future? What's your role? What have you created in that future? You meet other people who are interested in that, and then together you literally physically build that world with cardboard and string and sticky tape and pens. You spend 3 hours in it trading, celebrating, grieving. It's one of the most extraordinary things to be with 300 adults who have built a kind of a play future that they absolutely believe in. um, is one of the most beautiful things I've ever been part of. And then at the end, you all walk back behind the line, and there's tears on people's faces, and you turn around and you look back into the room, and now the future is full. And the future is full of all this. It's absolutely beautiful, and she's done it in lots of different places. So I'm always looking for those sort of practices that people do. What I love about the time machine stuff is, like, just saw you put up the message about the newsletter that I do. We do a feature in the newsletter called Time Machine of the Month, because I get more and more people sending me pictures of their time machines. There are some very eccentric people out there, Paul, I have to tell you, and they send me the pictures of their time machines. And the one of them, my favorite ones, was that I did in Banai Brechenniog National Park, what was the Brecon Beacons National Park. They wrote this extraordinary document, their like management plan for the park. It was called The Future, and it was this visionary, gorgeous document that had postcards from the future, photographs from the future, drawings about how the national park made this transition. It's gorgeous. And then I spoke at a conference at the Centre for Alternative Technology where the two women who wrote that report were there, and I was talking about time travel and building time machines. And they contacted me about 3 months later and said, "Rob, we've built a time machine." I said, "What do you mean you've built a time machine?" They said, "Well, we got back to the office and we found that we had a mobile planetarium that we had bought 5 years ago, because there was grants for planetariums, I guess, and they hadn't figured out what to do with it. And so they've repurposed it as a time machine, and it has these like, and they make these videos of the past where they have old black and white video of the food and farming system in the national park in the 1940s, into which they cut film of them dressed in the time talking about what the food system is like. Then they have a film about the present, and then they invite young people from schools to come in and make the videos about the future, to work together to figure out what the future should be. They are now passionate advocates that every local authority should be building a time machine. And yeah, they recently did it at the Abergavenny Food Festival. They did the catering and made pasties from the future. The lunch was pasties from the future. I said, "What was in them?" They said, "Oh, we'll send you one if you like in the post, Rob." I was like, "No, don't bother." I don't think the British postal system does pasties much good after a couple of days. But yeah, so more and more I'm finding people, and there's lots of stories and examples of it in the book, of organizations creating time machines, creating opportunities to play with time. It's not just necessarily building time machines. It's more this idea of temporal fluidity as a practice that so often in our activism we get stuck in the present. When do we want it? Now. No one ever says, when do we want it? In about 118 years or 72 years ago. It's always now, now, now. And the people like Black Quantum Futurism in the United States who do this beautiful stuff around time's just a construct, and we can move and we can use the future to help us understand the past and move between those two. That's what's kind of floating my boat right now.
There's a lot to dive into there, and we might even dive into thinking about time conceptually in some interesting ways. But you've just been talking about thinking about time travel as a mental construct, an alternative sort of mode of thought that we can practice, we can get good at, that can bring new rituals into being as we think about how we might do that. But there's a sense in which we're all mentally time traveling all the time. Almost everything we say, think, or write has a tense. I'm speaking in the present tense, which implies that anything that came before it would be in the past tense, anything after it would be in the future tense. So we're constantly projecting back and forth. And I wonder if, your activities and the way that you're thinking about time travel and the practices that you're encouraging, can they have an influence directly on our well-being and our agency in general, in that if we are constantly mentally time traveling, is there a neuroscience to mental time travel? Is there a way that we can enhance our happiness and success in life by practicing this as a skill? Is there a sort of
Yeah.
individual benefit to come out of this?
So I mentioned Black Quantum Futurism. Rashida Phillips, who was one of the co-founders of that, who's written an amazing book called Dismantling the Master's Clocks, which I really, really recommend. And she, every time she writes the word future, she puts an S in brackets after it, which I did. After all, I thought it was just a one-off, but I've noticed that the more I read of hers, it's what she always does.
Mm.
Yeah, the neuroscience is really fascinating to me. That um, that it's about giving people like if you're remembering the past or imagining the future in your brain, it's pretty much exactly the same process that happens. Basically, if you're trying to imagine the future, you're going to the cupboards of your memory, looking through them for things, and then assembling them, and that's the imagination part. So if you just watch Fox News all day, it's really hard to imagine a low carbon economy because you're going to the cupboards and there's nothing in there to work with, you know. It's like so. If you've never been to Italy before, Paul, and I said, Paul, I'm going to take you to Italy on a holiday, your brain sends a message to your memory and says, send up the file with Italy on it. And then your imagination basically assembles. Oh, I put my hand up without realizing I had. Your imagination then assembles that picture of it. And there's lots of research about um, how important that is in the context of climate change and how important the kind of stories we tell are as well. There was a study where they gave people two different stories of the future. One was a sort of green utopian one, and the other one was a sort of tech fantasy kind of future. And what they found was that actually it was the green one that gave people much more a sense of agency that they could get involved and make that happen, because the other one just felt like, well, that's just inevitably what's going to happen. I don't really need to do anything. So the kinds of stories that we tell are really, really important. And I guess my experience is that so last year before last, I spoke at Boomtown Festival, which is a massive electronic music dance festival. And they asked me to go and speak because every year they have a whole story that runs through the whole thing. And that in 2024, the story for the whole festival was based on From What Is to What If, the last book that I did. And so they asked me to go and speak, and I was speaking between Damian Marley and Earth, Wind and Fire. Can you imagine? And to about 9,000 people on the stage there. And they said, you got 6 minutes, Rob. You got 6 minutes. That's it. You can't go over 6 minutes. They said this again and again. You can't go over six. You got exactly. Yeah, 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 yeah. Okay. So I went and did this talk, and I got 5.5 minutes in, and the stage manager came running out and put this little piece of paper in front of me that said, "Earth, Wind, and Fire have disappeared. Keep talking." because they were like in their mid 80s. I think they just all sort of wandered off and they were trying to sort of herd Earth, Wind and Fire back to get them back on the stage. But the thing that after I did that talk, where I did it as a kind of, "Oh, I've just come back from the future and I need to tell you about it because it's amazing. And I've just parked my time machine around the corner. I've only got a few minutes, so listen to this." And someone sent me a message they'd seen on Reddit or one of these things, which was a young man who had all through university had smoked and then had started vaping and then had um and had but felt like that, well, that was just how it was always going to be, and he hadn't heard of me, didn't know anything about me, had turned up. There's this guy on the stage dressed like a time traveler with a sign saying I've been to the future, showing all these pictures from the future. And he said and it was the first time I realized that there were different futures and that there was a future in which I didn't smoke anymore.
Mm.
He'd never clocked it before that there could be a future in which that was the case. And he threw his vape in the bin and he hasn't smoked since. And I was like, okay, that's really, really interesting. That's really, really interesting. And I think the feedback I get when I do talks and when I do workshops and stuff is that it gives people not like some sort of naive kind of hope. But it gives people a kind of a it gives people something to be working towards. It gives people something, yeah, something to get up in the morning. Because the more you do that time travel work, the more you imagine that future, the more it comes into detail, the more it comes into focus, the more you see of what, like I said, we're working on a comic book at the moment with an amazing Belgian cartoonist, which is about field recordings from the future, about how we built a time machine, traveled to 2030 to collect all these recordings from the future. Um, and there we're into like, well, what do you see in the shop windows in 2030 when you walk down the street? What are the newspaper headlines? What are people wearing? So the more you allow yourself into that, I think you start to unlock
Mm.
a deeper sense of longing for it. I guess that's what it comes down to for me, is that word longing. Don DeLillo, the novelist, said longing on a large scale is what makes history, which is so important. And we forget that so much, I think, particularly when we just talk about collapse and extinction and it's like longing on a large scale. How do we cultivate longing on a large scale? And it feels to me when I look around the world like we love innovation. We pour billions and billions of dollars into innovation. I don't think we need to be doing that much more innovation because everything that we need to know to create a world in which we can survive and flourish and thrive, we know how to do because you can already see it working somewhere. The piece that's missing and the piece that's a bugger to get funding for, and I can tell you from personal experience, is that bit about how do we cultivate longing at scale. And I think that's much, much, much more important. And within this room, you are all the people, people who work in marketing, people who work in advertising. You're the guys who have the dark arts of how we do longing at scale. That's what you do. We need that. We need that to drive this stuff forward as well, I think.
Yeah, we'll come back to that because we'll come back to our dark arts and how we can be useful to you. But one thing I wanted to touch on is because when we think about inequality, our default settings, we think of inequalities of wealth. And of course, there's good reason for that. And there's every reason to be, as John Elkington put it to us, tooth rattlingly concerned about rising inequalities of wealth and income. But we've also talked in previous exchanges about inequalities of well-being, inequalities even of longevity and life expectancy. And it's also important, I sense from listening to you and from reading the book, to contemplate inequalities of influence over the future. I wonder if you could develop a little the importance of addressing those inequalities and how life can change. Maybe you have examples of how life might change for the better for all of us if we better democratize access to agency over the future.
Yeah, I mean, the I think we have to recognize that the ability to think hopefully and positively about the future is absolutely a privilege in the world right now. And there are many, many people who do not have that privilege. And what I explored in From What Is to What If was the idea that the more unequal a society becomes, the more we create the conditions in which it's harder to. I think that the more unequal a society becomes, we become less imaginative at the extremes. And the amazing work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett with their book Spirit Level, and that shows that the more unequal a society becomes, the more we see the rise in all the things that we don't want to see. And in From What Is to What If, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I spoke to lots of neuroscientists about this. And the the part of our brain where the imagination and our memory kind of fire from, the hippocampus, is so interesting because it's the part of the brain that is most vulnerable to cortisol. When we are anxious, stressed, in trauma, the hippocampus, when we have cortisol in our system, the hippocampus can shrink by up to 20%. And when that happens, people lose the ability to see the future in hopeful and positive ways. And they just get stuck in the present and stuck in the past. We are living in that world now, I think. We are very much living in a cortisol economy where so many more people's lives are more and more precarious and a kind of awash with cortisol, partly as well because of social media and this sort of constant outrage and constant cycle of kind of fight or flight that so many people end up in. And it's profoundly dangerous and kind of self-defeating, I think. And at the same time, we also have as Rashida Phillips and Black Quantum Futurism talk about so beautifully, we also have an uneven distribution of time. Time is not evenly shared throughout society. There are many, many people who have no time to do anything at all. And it's one of the in From What Is to What If, I write about this idea of, well, what if we had a National Imagination Act?
Mm.
A lot of people listening will be familiar with Polly Higgins's concept of ecocide. But actually, what people don't know about ecocide so much was she always saw ecocide as one side of a coin, and that the other side was what she called a transition enabling act. She said when the Victorians built the canals, they passed canal enabling acts that got out of the way all the blockages to those canals being built really quickly, really fast. And she said what we need is an act that identifies all the things that are blocking the rapid transition from happening and gets them out of the way. And and I kind of feel like we need the same in terms of imagination. It's being driven out of our education system. It's being driven out of most people's work life. It's been given very little value in society, but it's fundamentally important that our survival depends on it. And the more equal a society becomes, at the moment, I'm developing a show that's going to be touring later in the year, the Field Recordings from the Future. We're going to be doing it in 5 places in November, December next year, one of which will be the Globe Theatre in London, which is super exciting, where we will be creating a time portal and inviting the audience to step with us through it into the future. And we're working with Richard and Kate, who wrote Spirit Level, on that in getting them to, because that future will be much more equal. Would have to be much more equal in order for us to have achieved everything else. And so we're asking them to take to the graphs that they have in the book and to project them forward into, well, what would that look like in terms of what might mental health look like in 2036 if we had actively done everything to become a more equal society by then? What would physical health look like? What would crime and justice look like? And it's speculative. But there was a film a few years ago called 2040 that some of you may have seen, an Australian film about what the future could be like. And the guy, Daniel Gapo, who made that film, he described it as an exercise in evidence-based dreaming. And I love that so much. And that's what I feel the work that I do is it's an exercise in evidence-based dreaming. And we want to make a kind of a theatrical immersion into the future, which is rooted in evidence-based dreaming in that way.
It leads to an interesting. I want to read a comment from your book because one of your rules for time traveling seems really important in terms of evidence-based dreaming. It's the fifth rule, I think, from memory, but I've typed it out in my notes. So, never time travel for personal gain. Intention and motivation are all important. Travel for curiosity and the well-being of others. Why is that important? And is there a way to sell that to organizations that might want to envision a better future, but who are used to envisioning a future, at least partly, for the betterment of their success as an organization?
I think partly that came from the fact that I think a lot of early time travel books
Mm.
and stories were very much a kind of were very much rooted in a sort of colonial mindset. You know, some very kind of plummy English guy in plus fours and tweeds heading off into the future in the same way that we'd headed off into Africa and India, and that there's very much a kind of colonial element in a lot of kind of early time travel stuff that I was really trying to challenge, I think. Also because I think that's partly because I have a background in Buddhism, and I think that there's within Buddhism there's very much this idea that you set your intention. It's about the motivation, that the motivation to do something is really important, and that you should set a motivation which is about the well-being of others.
Mm.
And I kind of feel like, well, what would it be like if we had a kind of um, a program where loads and loads of people were time traveling into the future. If we're time traveling into the future, thinking, right, what can we get that we can bring back and we can make money out of? What can we get that we can bring back and exploit? I think that's very different than because one of those five golden rules of time travel is that you're not allowed, when you arrive in the future, you're not allowed to do any past splaining. So you're not allowed to arrive and go, yeah, right, like that's never going to work, because it is working, albeit quite fragile and it's emerging, but there's a growing confidence and belief that this stuff is going to work. And you can't rock up and go, yeah, that's never going to work. That's definitely prohibited in that. But I think for me, it's like the motivation by which we do things is really, really important. And when I do those kind of workshops and I'm teaching people how to do that, I want people to do it from the outset with a motivation of being of service, and that this is a time when, so next week I'm in HEC in Paris, which is one of the biggest kind of business universities, sort of place where people like Macron went to university. They bring me in to come and teach and to do this stuff there. And with them, I'm like, I'm teaching you to time travel, not so you can get the idea that's going to mean that you're a millionaire by the time you're 30 and you can retire by the time you're 30. I'm taking you there because I want you to come back to 2026 and throw everything that you've got at the climate and ecological emergency that we're in right now. So that's why it feels to me like making the motivation clear from the beginning is really important.
I actually think that is of great benefit even to organizations that would like to achieve a greater level of success. It strikes me that when you start with a higher order of analysis of just what is needed, then the possibilities that you can see are so much greater than if you start with some kind of self-directed goal. And a subset of those opportunities will be not just beneficial for everybody else, but also beneficial for us. And so I think that taking that moment to elevate our view, to take ourselves out of the picture, actually, in the first instance, just
Yeah.
to explore what's needed is of benefit to all of us individually and organizationally. And I thought that for now we might transition back towards those dark arts that you mentioned. So your book, you are kind enough to mention that the kinds of people we have with us today and listening afterwards are among the people who might be able to cultivate that kind of large scale longing that you describe. We're an interesting company because you in that group you also include poets, screenwriters, science fiction writers, street artists, novelists, musicians, perfumier, designers, artists, chef, dancers, set designers, rappers, and interestingly, specifically, people who are good at projecting light into buildings. So we're in some very interesting. I know there's a story behind that as well. If we do,
There is.
in case we get back to that. But what would you like marketers, advertisers, the narrators of organizational life to do?
Um, I mean, I would love there to be. So when I go into companies and I do work with companies,
Mm.
I would say I'm not interested in your sustainability plan strategy. Great that you've got one, but I'm not really that interested. What I want to know is, how is this organization going to act as if this is a climate and ecological emergency? Because that's very, very different, right? If it's an emergency, you pull your finger out, you act fast, you think really differently. We saw it during COVID, right? You had companies that made engines for Formula One racing cars who within weeks were making ventilators. You had breweries who repurposed all their kit to start making hand sanitizer. And we found the money and we shifted things around. Climate change is in infinitely more of a huge challenge than COVID ever was. So I so for me the question is, how do we cultivate longing at scale? And people who so within companies, my challenge is how do we how do you fundamentally reimagine what's going on here in the context of this new reality? Because it's not okay to just sit and imagine business as usual. The world is going to change profoundly in the next 10 or 15 years. And if you do nothing, business as usual is going to mean it's going to change profoundly in horrendous, horrific ways. So let's get on the front foot proactively and start changing it. But by focusing on that, there's a climate scientist called Peter Kalmus that I spoke to when I wrote the book. I said, "What's the best thing we can hope for, Peter?" He said, "Well, if we go into what I call emergency mode, where we rapidly phase out meat and industrial meat production and fossil fuels, we could find a way to stay under 2 degrees, and then we use various ways to sort of come back down again." And he said, "I call that going into emergency mode." I said, "Peter, that's brilliant. But going into emergency mode is a rubbish name for it. Can't we reframe it as delicious opportunity mode or thrilling adventure mode?" And that's where the marketing brain comes in. If you can sell people a can of fizzy water with caffeine and sugar in it that'll rot your teeth and isn't really, really bad for you, you can surely we can find the ways to inspire people and excite people about living in a city with urban agriculture everywhere and cycle lanes and clean air and sort of a greener city with more trees that's cooler, and we've got surely we can find the ways to do that. So I guess whenever I go into companies, it's like, we need you. We need you. And you have and like I've spent years with the transition movement where people are doing extraordinary things with nothing. With nothing. They have very little in the way of kind of budgets in terms of funding. They have no marketing experts. They have no budget business planning experts, but they figure it out and they do it. Imagine what they could do if local companies, local businesses seconded their marketing people to work with that transition group for a day a month, or their advertising people, their enterprise people. Around every company there is an extraordinary emerging movement of community energy companies, local food projects, communities setting up their own farms, creating all sorts of amazing local food projects. Get involved, be part of that. Put down roots where your company is and be part of this transition that's happening, because you can be guaranteed there will be people who work for you who are part of that, who, when they arrive at work, feel that's the hat they have to take off and put on their sensible hat and go to work. Let's bring this stuff back together again, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I can't resist. As we're at Marketing Kind, for anyone listening or here who's not a member of Marketing Kind, we have a session every month, a coffee with a cause session, where we work collectively on building a growth strategy for a pioneering charity or social enterprise. And very often, that is a charity or social enterprise working at the cutting edge of some dimension of tackling our future sustainability. And we also have a volunteering platform called Pimp My Cause that any marketer, whether or not they're a member of Marketing Kind, can participate in as a sort of online dating of pro bono marketing.
Fabulous.
I particularly recommend joining Marketing Kind and working on these issues as a group, because it is so much more mutually reinforcing, and the outcomes are so interesting. We can think of marketing as a department within an organization like finance or HR, but you can also think of marketing as a narrative-based discipline alongside other narrative-based disciplines like psychology or history. And the unique thing about marketing within narrative-based disciplines is these are stories of exchange. Essentially at the heart of marketing is I offer you A and I ask B in return. And if we get that exchange right, I think that can be a powerful way to to move forwards, and to dig our way out of the hole that we're finding ourselves in. We've toyed with the idea of having an exploration of marketing 2050. This was inspired by a former MarketingKind xChange guest, Malka Older, who was a former aid worker, and she writes brilliant speculative fiction. And she actually wrote a commissioned article, not one of her novels, but a commissioned article for a humanitarian newspaper on disaster response in 2051. And the reason wasn't necessarily to project what will disaster response look like in 2051, but as a device for saying, well, what could we be doing now if we weren't constrained by today's power dynamics and organizational inertia? If we were to think about a marketing 2050, what tips would you give us? How might we get our time machine right to get a group of people together to think, okay, what could and should marketing look like in 2050?
I mean, where that was sending my brain, what if 2050 had a marketing department, and and its role was to be sending what if the future had a marketing department in the same way that Dubai markets itself as a destination? What if what if it was able to send back invitations and provocations and stories from that 2050 that turned out just absolutely extraordinary. If it found a way to send broadcasts or time capsules. I was talking to Rashida Phillips yesterday. I interviewed her for the podcast that I do from Black Quantum Futurism, and she was talking about how they do work where they create time capsules from the future, and I love that kind of idea. That what marketing can do, I think, and what good, those sort of dark arts that we were talking about, is those really smart ways of getting. It's not just about what does that 2050 look like. It's like, what does it feel to live in that 2050? Like how proud are people to be there? How proud do people feel that people in 2050, the older people who are there in 2050, how proud do they feel that the younger people now sing great songs and tell great stories about the extraordinary work they did during that time? As part of this live show that we're developing, part of the end of the show is that we say, and actually a part of this time travel technology that we didn't explain to you at the beginning was that it has summoned you all here today. You are all here today with us in 2026 because we know, and this technology knows, that this room full of people was the people who made this shift happen. We are honored to stand in your midst. You must be so proud and amazing and amazed by the work that you did. It's like that. If we can find those ways to do that, that we can help people. If marketing can help people fall in love with cars and toothpaste, marketing can absolutely help people fall in love with the future, and not just a kind of a future in a lazy kind of, oh well, it's just like the future but with better phones and smarter cars, but in a future that is profoundly reimagined and reshaped around wellness and connection and nature. Of course you can do that. Of course you can.
Yeah, I think even more fundamentally than making people fall in love with toothpaste and cars, underneath it is usually we fall in love with the impression we believe we will create with other people
Yeah,
as a result. And so I
like our
think,
social standing, you mean, that will result from that.
yeah, I think that if we can find a way to reappraise the means that we use to not necessarily impress each other because that's already loaded against us, I think, as a concept, but to stand out to each other, to stand for something so that I am recognizable as me, you're recognizable as you, and we can find our crowd in a way that is life supporting. We've talked a lot about what is in the future, but I wonder if any of this inspires anything in your mind in terms of what we can leave out of the future. When sometimes it can be a relief to let go of the past. Um, is there something attractive in a future where there are certain types of things that maybe we don't need to do anymore?
When we started Transition Town Totnes, 2006, one of the very first things that I did was a load of oral history interviews. And I went out and spoke to people who lived in Totnes in the 1940s, 1950s. I have no memory of that. At a time when Totnes was much more local, cheap energy was still not really a thing. Uh, uh, and what was that world like? And at the end, I asked everybody, what were the things that you're really glad we left behind?
Mm.
And what are the things you wish we'd carried forward with us? And I remember the top two things people said, I'm really glad we left coal behind. And it was also the first time I got a real understanding of what a vitally important invention the washing machine was, particularly in the lives of women. Like people's accounts of doing wash day on Monday and washing everything by hand and mangles and coppers and just absolutely horrible. So there are definitely some things that I hope we carry forward. I hope that we have I hope that we have left cynicism behind, because I think cynicism just blocks so much stuff. We just trip ourselves up all the time. I was really intrigued last year to see a survey that said that 48% of young people said they'd rather live without the internet, and that use of social media peaked in 2022 and has already fallen by about 15%. Use of dating apps is declining rapidly. Some of those big companies are kind of financially in trouble because people are using them less. I really hope that we've left a lot of that stuff behind or developed a very different relationship with it. When I do my talks and I show pictures that I've taken in 2036 that I've brought back with me, one of those is a picture that I took in Geneva at an event I was at where they filled this whole square in the middle of Geneva with tables and everyone was eating together and hanging out together. And I recontextualized this photograph as a picture that I took on a recent visit to 2036. And I say, in this future, it's about connection. People are moving away from the idea that the online communities are really a community and are moving towards this idea that it's about real people that you sit with. And so you have all through, and you see the evidence of that as you move through the city, because you see things like this where people come together to eat together, to play together, play games together, to make music together, just to hang out together. And you can see those sort of fractured social threads that had so unraveled in 2026, that like mycelium, they were sort of starting to, I've put my hand up again without meaning to, that they were, I hope we get rid of that by 2030, because it's horrible, that actually those threads had started to kind of weave themselves. And you could see that in the fabric of the cities as you come back together again. I think that feels like one of the most fundamental things that we have, that city planning, education is all reoriented towards human connection and bringing people closer together.
Yeah, I think that just as the Industrial Revolution created a lot of prosperity, but had the shadow side of carbon emissions and other pollutants, the digital revolution, now the AI revolution, has so much potential in terms of connecting us to each other and to the world's knowledge, but clearly has a shadow side in terms of polarization, societal fracturing. Humans have evolved to live within a fairly narrow set of boundaries, and our technology environment may be changing that in a way which could be as dangerous or more than the climate emergency in some
Yeah,
ways.
yeah, absolutely. I think a
Because
shadow
it's
side is generous.
undermining our ability to address problems like the climate
Yeah, yeah,
emergency.
yeah. And I
Very
absolutely,
dramatic.
I think a shadow side is kind of generous in that context. My worry is that actually AI becomes like a form of sort of collective BSE. Like the more that we hand over things that we would normally do, mental functions, like when we hand our creativity and our imagination over to that, we leave great big gaps that are fundamentally important to us. When I do talks, there's a little story that I had in From What Is to What If, where I asked people to imagine that they're in the Yellow House in Arles on Place Lamartine in 1888, and Vincent van Gogh comes into the kitchen with this gorgeous bunch of sunflowers he's just bought in the market, and he arranges them on a table in a little earthenware pot as the sun comes in through the window, and he sits and looks at them and lights his pipe, and then he thinks, oh, I must just check my Instagram. Oh, and I must just check my Facebook and my Twitter and my TikTok. And 2 hours later, he's watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs and can't remember why he even started watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs. Then he never would have painted those paintings.
Mm.
And those paintings that have touched and dazzled people for over 100 years, because art is distilled attention. And when our attention span depletes, it leaves us in a really, really vulnerable position, which is, I think, a lot of the problems we're seeing in the world because we just don't have the attention for complex issues and for complex things. I don't think that AI will improve that. And in many ways, to create a technology in 2026 that requires massive amounts of energy, huge amounts of water. AI already consumes more water than the global bottled water industry does, and it's only just got started. And that requires building lots of concrete and steel buildings all over the place, is possibly one of the worst things we can possibly do right now. We need less water, to use less water, less energy. And the carrot that's dangled that one day somehow AI will tell us how to tackle climate change. We already know how to tackle climate change. We just need to get on with it.
One of our members, one of our guests on the call is working on the early stages on a book on the attention economy, and I'm sure a lot of that will resonate. But Anna, you said you had a question.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Rob, for all of your work. I studied the permaculture design course
Oh,
in
great.
London about 17 years ago. And I remember learning about the transition town movement then and just being so inspired by it. And living in London, you know, you're surrounded by incredible people who are many of them very passionate about tackling climate change. And I now live in the Northwest and talking to neighbors here, it's a little bit different. I I think that many of them are reform voters and don't have much interest in nature even. It's hard to find what is going to inspire them.
I think the thing is, in any context like that, is to find your allies because they will absolutely be there. I remember after a few years of transition, this woman ringing us, emailing us from Australia, and she said, "I'm the only person in my town who's interested in transition. No one else is interested at all. What should I do?" And we said, are you sure? How do you know you're the only person who's interested in? Do you know everybody in your town, and you know for sure no one's interested? And so she wrote to us again 3 months later. She said, "I put an advert in my local paper, and 140 people replied." You know, it's like wherever you are, there will be some people, and find your allies. And you know, there's that famous Margaret Mead quote about only small groups of people, whatever, change the world. I've seen so many amazing projects that have come through transition with like a group of 5 or 6 people who just decide, right, should we do this? Let's do it. And I think one of the best ways to get people on board is to do something which very clearly addresses a local need, but to do it in a transition way. So now after nearly 20 years of transition here in Totnes, we have, for example, one project which is called Food in Community, which started with a group of people who went out to Riverford, which is a big organic farm on the outside of Totnes, and went through their grade out, like the stuff that was actually fine to eat, but a little bit knobbly and not good enough to go in the veg boxes. And they would create from that food parcels that they would take to people in food poverty in the town. That then evolved into them doing like a community kitchen and teaching people to cook and doing pay what you can afford meals. They've recently got £1.5 million from DEFRA to create a kind of food resilience hub where they take gleanings from local farmers and surplus from different places and they process it and freeze it, and then they can supply retail to different local caterers. They can provide stuff to food caterers that comes from that system. It's brilliant and a very replicable model. And also we have a project which is called Transition Homes, where they're now building 39 homes for local people in housing need, ecological homes. Those are projects which very much are explicitly transition projects. But I think even if you're a reform voter and you think climate change isn't real, building 39 homes for people in everyone gets that there's a housing emergency. You might not see there's a climate emergency, but there's definitely a housing emergency. And so we're kind of addressing those needs, that the needs that people see, but also doing transition. And it's a lot of the things that we did, like for example, we had a project called, which I loved the name of it. We called it Totnes, the nut tree capital of Britain, which was where we were planting hybrid walnut trees and different trees through the town. There's about 550 of them now as a food security biodiversity strategy. We had people who came out every other weekend to plant trees and then to look after those trees, maintain those trees. I don't think many people who were there were particularly motivated by climate change. It was a social thing where they could get out and meet people and do something that was fun. There was a deeper purpose to it, but it was a kind of an engaging, fun thing. So I think maybe we take the "you have to believe in climate change" label off the front, and we find ways that we can collaborate with other organizations to do things that feel like they will improve the quality of life for people and have fun and meet people. And then at the end, it turns out actually you've done. We did a project here called Transition Streets, one of the real successes here, which was a project where people would form groups on their street and they would meet in each other's houses for 7 weeks. And you'd look at energy one week, water the next week. We did it in 2013. 550 households in Totnes took part, which is something like an eighth of housing. It was a really big deal. And what was so interesting was at the end, when they were surveyed by Plymouth University, all the data came in, and people were asked what they got out of it. On average, people cut their carbon emissions by 1.3 tons. They saved £600 a year each. When they were surveyed, no one mentioned that. Everybody said, I know my neighbors better. It's great. I feel much more part of my community. I feel so much more connected. No one talked about climate change. No one talked about energy depletion, none of that stuff. So if we're skillful, we can find the ways to engage people in doing this stuff in a way that it's more about cost of living and energy bills. Maybe we reframe cutting. We want to cut your carbon emissions. We want to save your energy bills. We want to reduce your energy. Find smart ways to do that. But you are almost certainly, I guarantee, not the only person where you live who gives a shit about this stuff. There will be other people.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
also your comments hark back to that idea that in marketing, we're not so much selling what we appear to be selling. We're selling the connections that we perceive we may be able to generate as a result, and finding better approaches to that. I recall, for example, something that we have used locally is Olio, where people swap surplus food.
Oh yeah.
And the founders of that did some research into their volunteers, their users, and found that actually the primary benefit people got was getting to know their neighbors and mental health benefits.
Well, that's why I remember it was when we had the Totnes pound, we had a local currency here in Totnes for 11 years, the Totnes pound, which doesn't exist anymore, sadly. It stopped in 2019. But actually, if you go to France, there are 83 local currencies in France that still exist that were inspired by the Totnes pound. And there was a study that showed that when people went shopping with local currency, they had like 20 or 30 more conversations than when they went shopping with a plastic card. And so when we have this epidemic of loneliness that we have right now, wouldn't it be interesting if you started to reframe a local currency as a city mental health strategy? And in France, in Grand Avignon, they have a local currency called La Roue, which means the wheel. And the municipality there, after COVID, put the local currency at the center of its strategy for rebuilding the local economy after COVID, and said that for every €10 worth you bought, they would boost that up to 12. And so you start to, I kind of help, I can't help thinking that actually so much of what we need to do to create the 2030, the 2050 that we've been talking about here today is about mental health as well. If you set out to design a city where mental health flourishes, where women feel safe, where everybody feels safe walking about, where then Housing is a mental health strategy. Food is a mental health strategy. You could design a radical housing plan for a city to get people out of homelessness, and you frame it as a mental health strategy. You could frame urban agriculture as a mental health strategy for a city. You could absolutely frame building cycling networks everywhere as a mental health strategy. The science on that is very, very clear. So, we're in because in the Netherlands, the government there, they spend €500 million every year building amazing cycling infrastructure because their calculation is that that then saves them €19 billion off the national health bill. Like it's an investment, and we need to be looking at all of this in the same, much more holistic kind of a way, I think.
That's absolutely right. We had one of our exchanges with Andy Burnham, Mayor of
Okay, great.
Manchester. And one of the things that he talked about as being the greatest value of having a mayor was being able to take a joined up place-based approach as opposed to government, which is usually just so fragmented and siloed. And one of his successes was finding ways to work, for example, on mental health and employment simultaneously for particular groups of people. And it did seem to be an approach that was very successful. But as we're sort of running low on time, I think that everyone has been fascinated and would like more Rob in their lives, not less. So what can you tell us about the Time Traveller's Gazette and any other ways that people can attend your shows or dive more deeply into the topic of time travel with you during this year? And once again, we certainly recommend Falling in Love with the Future.
Thank you.
So what can people do to
So as Paul said, so I do a newsletter so that process that led to that book didn't stop when that book was published, and I'm always looking out for interesting things and people doing good things. And so I do a newsletter every month called the Time Traveller's Gazette. You just go to robhopkins.net, put your email address in the email newsletter box at the top. I I do a 2-day training, how to fall in love with the future training. I do it twice a year at Hawkwood House near Stroud. I'm doing it in February. I think that one's full, but it'll happen again July 6th to 8th. If anybody would like to come and learn some of this stuff or practice some of this stuff with me, keep an eye out. And if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll hear about it anyway. But we're going to be doing 5 shows at the end of the year. I think one in Wales, one in Dundee, one in Sheffield, one in Bristol, and one in London. The one in London will be at the Globe Theatre, where we will be creating a festival of the future in each place, working with Manda Scott, who's been on here. So it's where she will be running workshops on utopian storytelling, and we'll be doing field recordings from the future. I spoke to somebody who works in tech who said, "Oh, I've been to several festivals of the future. They're always so bloody miserable." And actually, the idea with this, it will be unapologetically joyful and positive and celebratory. So keep an eye out for that. My website is robhopkins.net. There's lots of things on there, lots of resources on there. And the Transition Network is transitionnetwork.org. There's lots of resources on there for how to do transition, including a great free download called The Essential Guide to Doing Transition, which is everything that you need to know in order to start transition. And you'll find me on Instagram and on LinkedIn, and most of the rest of the other ones I've stopped doing because they're run by fascists.
So thank you so much, Rob. This conversation has fascinated us. As given your particular skill set, you presumably knew in advance that it would.
That's why I came.
I particularly enjoyed your idea for us of creating a sort of tourist information agency for the future. And I think that is definitely something that we will want to work on. I hope that 2026 will be your best year so far, and a beautiful segue towards the 2030 that you've already experienced. We'd love you to join any of our future conversations that you would like to join with us. And on that note, 3 of the most forthcoming ones include our next Your Marketing Kind, which will be with Thomas Colster, Mr. Goodvertising, who many of us know, on marketing effectiveness and his recent research with Walk, and that will be on January 27th. Our next exchange is with Tony Juniper, Chair of Natural England and author of Just Earth, which will be on February 4th. And our subsequent Your Marketing Kind, I mention, as it is with Sarah Housley, who is also a futurist and is the author of Designing Hope, which will be on February 24th.
Which is great, which I'm reading at the moment, and is fantastic.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I almost have it to hand. So there may be a big crush bang wallet. So this is what Designing Hope looks like. And if people check out our website, we're putting in future gatherings all the time, and it is one of the most exciting schedules that we've ever had. So do check out what is coming up in later months in the year as well. And finally, once again, thank you, Rob, so much for everything that has led up to today, and for everything for today, and for everything that we're going to continue to do into that beautiful future that we are creating with you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Much appreciated.